Chapter 1, Backpacks and Ghosts. The aisle was aggressively pink. Brian Keller stood halfway down it, holding a basket in one hand and his 6-year-old daughter's future in the other. At least, that's how it felt. Lily was currently kneeling on the floor, surrounded by backpacks that glittered with such intensity they could probably be seen from orbit. "This one," she declared, lifting a bag covered in sequins that changed color when you brushed them. "No, wait." She flipped the sequins the opposite way and frowned. "Actually, I think this one is too mood swing." Brian blinked. "Too what?" "Mood swing," Lily repeated with absolute authority. "It keeps changing its mind." "Yeah," he said slowly. "That seems exhausting." She nodded solemnly, as though she'd been carrying that burden for years, then tossed it aside and grabbed another. This one had unicorns. Multiple unicorns. An unreasonable number of unicorns. Brian crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. "We can only get one, kiddo." "I know," she said, not looking at him. "That's why this is serious." He bit back a smile. Serious, apparently, meant selecting between various levels of sparkle. He let his eyes drift down the aisle, scanning rows of bright color, cartoon characters, and aggressively cheerful slogans about being amazing. Rebecca would have loved this. The thought arrived without warning, as it often did. Not sharp anymore, not the breath-stealing kind, but still there, persistent, quiet. She would have been kneeling right there next to Lily, weighing the merits of unicorns versus sequins like it was a boardroom decision. She would have made it fun, turned it into a game, probably convinced Lily that choosing the backpack was some kind of adventure instead of a slow march through too many options. Brian swallowed and pushed the thought gently aside. Not away. He didn't do that anymore. Just aside. "Hey," he said, nudging Lily's shoulder lightly. "What about picking one that can hold books?" Radical concept. Lily gasped. "They all hold books, Dad." "Well, that's a relief," he said. "For a second, I thought we were just buying decorative luggage." She giggled, then held up the unicorn bag again. "I think this one feels like me." "That's a strong argument." "It is," she agreed. He was about to concede because of course he was, when something tugged at the edge of his attention. Not a sound, not exactly. More like a shift. The sense that something didn't belong where it was. Brian straightened slightly, his gaze moving past Lily, past the display shelves, to the front of the store. And then he saw her. Caroline Baxter stood behind a register, scanning items with practiced efficiency. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, pulled back in a loose ponytail. The store uniform, dark polo name tag, looked strangely out of place on her, like it had landed there by accident. For a moment, Brian didn't move. It wasn't just that he hadn't seen her in months. It was that his brain couldn't quite reconcile the image in front of him with the one he carried. The Caroline who stood in conference rooms, who argued strategy with Rebecca, who moved through their shared history like she belonged there. Because she did belong there. "Dad." Lily's voice pulled him back. He looked down, realizing his grip on the basket had tightened. "Yeah," he said, exhaling. "Yeah, sorry. That one's good. The unicorn one wins." "Really? Really?" he said. "Go grab it. We're checking out." She sprang to her feet, triumphant, and raced toward the shelf. Brian followed, slower now, his attention fixed on the front of the store. On Caroline. By the time they reached the line, his pulse had settled into something steady but deliberate. Lily swung the backpack over her shoulders as if she'd already started school. "Do I look ready?" she asked, spinning once. "You look like you might blind the teacher," Brian said. "But yeah, ready." She beamed. When it was their turn, Caroline glanced up automatically and froze. For half a second, neither of them spoke. Then her expression shifted. Surprise first, unmistakable and bright, followed by something softer, warmer. "Brian?" she said. "Hey, Caroline." The space between them closed quickly. She stepped around the counter without hesitation and pulled him into a tight hug. He returned it just as firmly, one hand pressing briefly against her back. "Hi," she said again when she pulled away. Like the word wasn't enough the first time. "Hi." Her attention dropped to Lily, and her smile changed, gentler now, touched with something that looked a lot like memory. "Oh wow," she said softly. "You got big." Lily grinned. "I do that." Caroline laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and crouched down to Lily's level. "You look just like your mom, sweetie." The words landed carefully, but they still carried weight. Brian let them sit for a second, then cleared his throat. "Caroline," he said, keeping his tone even. "Why are you working here?" She blinked, the question clearly not what she expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said more directly now. "Why are you working here?" Confusion flickered across her face. "After the company let me go," she said. "I needed a job." Brian stared at her. "What? They fired you?" he asked. "Yes," she said slowly. "Brian. It was years ago." His mind stumbled over the timeline. No, that's not." He shook his head. "Why didn't you call me?" Caroline straightened, her expression tightening. Not defensive, but certain. "Because they told me it was your decision." What? They said it was coming from you, she said. That the company was moving in a different direction. That you wanted a clean break. For a second, the noise of the store fell away. Brian felt it then. Not the sudden kind of anger, not the explosive version. This was slower, controlled, the kind that built carefully piece by piece. I never said that, he said, each word clear. I never authorized anything like that. The last time I talked to the board, I told them you should be CEO. Caroline's eyes widened. They didn't tell me that. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm starting to get that. Lily shifted beside him, sensing the change without understanding it. Brian rested a hand on her shoulder automatically. Caroline hesitated, then shook her head slightly, as if trying to reset. It doesn't matter now, she said. That was a long time ago. It matters, Brian said. He looked at her, really looked this time. The uniform, the tired edges she wasn't quite hiding. The gap between what should have been and what was. Are you okay? He asked. She hesitated again. Just a fraction. Yeah, she said. We're okay. We, Mark and the kids, she said. We had to downsize after I lost the job. Brian closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Okay, he said. There was a clarity to it now. A line drawn. Here's what's going to happen, he continued, his voice calm but firm. You're going to tell your manager you quit. Caroline stared at him. Brian, and then you're going to go home, he said. Get Mark, get the kids, and come over to my house. Why? He didn't hesitate. Because we've got a lot of work to do, he said. Chapter 2. Dinner and Decisions. By the time Brian pulled into his driveway, Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her unicorn backpack clutched to her chest like a hard-won prize. He sat there for a moment after turning off the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, the quiet of the car settling around him. The world felt shifted, slightly off-center, like a picture frame knocked crooked on the wall. Caroline, fired. 6 months after Rebecca died. By his direction, Brian exhaled slowly, then pushed the door open and stepped out. He walked around to the passenger side, lifted Lily gently from her seat, and carried her inside. She stirred just enough to mumble something about extra glitter, then went limp again against his shoulder. Terrifying, he murmured. We'll address the glitter situation later. He tucked her into bed, easing the backpack from her grip with minimal resistance. It ended up draped over the bedpost, gleaming faintly like it knew it had won something important. Brian stood there for a moment watching her sleep. Then he turned and headed downstairs. He didn't sit, didn't pace either, not exactly. He moved, quietly, steadily, through the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, setting them on the counter. Cooking wasn't about hunger tonight. It was about doing something useful while his mind arranged itself into focus. Pasta went into a pot. Water boiled. Pan warmed. He reached for his phone, considered calling the board immediately, then stopped himself. Not yet. This required more than a phone call, more than anger. It needed clarity, information, and he exhaled again, backup. Caroline. He glanced at the clock. They'd need time, so he cooked. An hour later, the house smelled like garlic, tomatoes, and something calming he didn't have a name for. The table was set, nothing elaborate, just enough for more people than usual. Brian wiped his hands on a dish towel just as headlights swept across the front windows. Right on time. He opened the door before they could knock. Caroline stood on the porch, one hand on the shoulder of a boy Brian recognized vaguely, 10, maybe 11, and the other resting on the back of a younger girl who was peering around her leg with cautious curiosity. Mark stood just behind them, holding what appeared to be a hastily assembled grocery bag. Hey, Mark said. We brought bread? I panicked in aisle 4. Brian smiled, a quick flash of something genuine. Bread is a strong showing under pressure. Come in. The mood hovered awkwardly for about 3 seconds. Then the kids moved first. Whoa. Lily's voice rang out from the top of the stairs, fully awake now. You have kids. Caroline laughed despite herself. We do. Lily came barreling down the stairs like she'd been personally invited to chaos. Hi, I'm Lily. My dad let me get the glitter backpack. That tells me everything I need to know, Mark said gravely. Introductions followed in a flurry, names overlapping, voices rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Within minutes, the kids had migrated to the living room, where some kind of cooperative game involving cushions and blankets began without formal agreement. Brian stepped back, watching the shift happen almost effortlessly. Kids were good at that, bridging gaps adults tended to step around. You want a drink? He asked, turning toward the kitchen. Mark followed him in. Water's great. Anything that doesn't come from aisle 4 under duress. Brian handed him a glass. How've you been? Mark gave a small shrug. We're okay. Adjusting. He paused, then added, This? He gestured vaguely toward the living room. This is already better than most Tuesdays. Brian nodded once. That tracked. Caroline lingered near the doorway, as if unsure whether to fully step back into a space that used to feel familiar. You can come in, Brian said, softer now. She did. though she stayed near the counter, fingers curling lightly against the edge. Dinner came together quickly after that. Plates were filled, kids were herded loosely into chairs, and conversation found its footing somewhere between polite and real. "So," Mark said, twirling pasta thoughtfully, "you said there's a lot of work to do. That's usually how crime documentaries start. Should I be concerned?" "No crime," Brian said. "Just correction." "That's slightly better," Mark replied. "Marginally." Caroline's eyes moved between them, tension tucked just beneath the surface again. "Brian," she said quietly, "you don't have to do anything. That was a long time ago." "No," he said simply. "It wasn't." The table quieted, not completely because the kids were still debating whether dinosaurs could beat unicorns in a fight, but enough. "I told the board," Brian continued, resting his forearms lightly on the table, "that you should be CEO." Caroline's gaze didn't waver this time. "They never said that." "I figured," he said. "What they did say," he paused, choosing the next part carefully, "was that they'd handle it." Mark huffed a dry laugh. "That's corporate for this will go poorly, but in a way that sounds polite." Brian smiled faintly. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." Caroline shook her head once. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything now. They moved on. The company moved on." "That's the problem," Brian said. "They didn't." She frowned slightly. "What?" "They used my name," he said, "to fire you, to justify decisions I didn't make." His tone stayed even, controlled. "I've been hands off. I thought that was the right thing. Give people space to keep things steady." Caroline studied him. "And now," he said, "I think I was wrong." Across the table, Lily leaned over to Caroline's daughter. "My dad builds stuff," she whispered, not particularly quietly. "Like real stuff, with wood." "That's cool," the girl whispered back. "He also makes pancakes shaped like dinosaurs," Lily added. Brian glanced over. "That was one time." "It was an important time," Lily insisted. Mark smiled into his glass. "You're building quite the resume." Brian shook his head, but the tension eased just enough to let the moment breathe. Caroline exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Let's say you're right. What does that change?" "It changes everything," Brian replied, "because I'm not staying out of it anymore." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like step one of a plan. Is there a step two? Or are we freestyling?" "There's a step two," Brian said, looking back at Caroline. "You," she blinked. "Me? You know that company," he said. "Better than anyone except me. And honestly, probably better than me in the parts that matter day to day." "That was years ago," she said. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "You were there from the start. You didn't just work there, you built it." Caroline's fingers tightened slightly against her napkin. "Brian, I'm not asking you to go back to what it was," he said. "I'm asking you to help me figure out what it's become, and what it should be." Mark leaned back in his chair, considering. "You're talking about walking into a situation that already pushed her out once," he said. "Just to be clear." "I know," Brian said. "I'm also talking about walking in as the majority owner who didn't authorize any of it." That landed differently. Caroline looked at him, really looked this time, not for the past, but for what he meant now. "And if I say no?" she asked. Brian nodded once. "Then I still make it right," he said. "But I'd rather not do it without someone who knows what they're doing." Mark tilted his head. "Good answer," he said. Caroline let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting a long time. "This isn't just about a job," she said. "We rearranged our entire life after I lost that one." "I know," Brian replied. "That's part of why this matters." Silence hovered for a moment. Not heavy, just full. From the living room, a cushion hit the wall with a soft thump, followed by someone declaring, "That was definitely a flying dinosaur." Caroline closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Okay," she said. Brian's expression didn't change much, but something behind it settled. "Okay," he repeated. "Okay," she said again, firmer this time. "I'll help you." Mark nodded once beside her. "Then I'm in for moral support and emergency bread procurement." Brian let out a quiet breath, tension unwinding just a fraction. "Good," he said, "because we're going to need both." Chapter 3, The Boardroom Awakens. The boardroom had windows that didn't open. Brian noticed that first. Not because it mattered, but because it felt like the kind of detail Rebecca would have pointed out with quiet amusement before dismantling whatever argument someone was trying to make. Something about perspective. About seeing clearly even when the room was designed to keep things sealed. He stood just outside the glass door for a moment, hand resting lightly on the handle, watching the silhouettes inside. 7 people around a long table, laptops open, coffee cups placed with intention, controlled conversation, all of it wrapped in the kind of professional calm that meant nothing had actually been resolved yet. Caroline stood half a step behind him. "You don't have to come in," he said without turning. "Yes, I do," she replied, just as quiet. That earned the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough." He opened the door. The conversation inside didn't stop immediately. It softened, stuttered. then came to a gradual halt as attention shifted toward the unexpected interruption. "Brian," one of them said, rising halfway out of his chair before fully committing. "We weren't expecting." "I know," Brian said, stepping in. "That's kind of the point." Silence followed that, measured and careful. The man who had stood, Gregory Ellison, chair of the board, folded his hands in front of him and regained composure with practiced ease. "Of course," Gregory said smoothly. "We're glad you could join us. It's been some time." Brian crossed the room without rushing, pulling out a chair near the head of the table. He didn't take Rebecca's seat. Not yet. Not today. Caroline stayed near the wall, not quite seated, not quite invisible either. "I've been getting the reports," Brian said as he sat. "Quarterly summaries. High-level metrics." "Yes," another board member chimed in, eager. "We've maintained strong performance. Growth has been steady." "That's good," Brian interrupted mildly. "I like steady." He let that sit for half a second, then leaned back in his chair. "I've got a few questions." The air shifted. Gregory gestured toward him. "Of course. That's what we're here for." "Great," Brian said. "Let's start simple." He looked directly at Gregory. "Why was Caroline Baxter fired from the company 6 months after my wife died?" No one answered immediately. A man halfway down the table, a neat suit, precise posture, cleared his throat. "Personnel decisions are often complex, Brian. At the time, the company was undergoing—" "Who made the call?" Brian asked. The interruption was calm, almost conversational. "That would have been a joint decision," Gregory said. "The executive leadership team consulted with the board, taking into account the direction. Did I authorize it?" Another pause, smaller this time. "Well," Gregory said carefully, "we understood that you prefer to transition toward a different operational structure." Brian tilted his head slightly. "That's not what I asked." The room grew quieter. "Did I," he repeated, "authorize her termination?" Gregory held his gaze. For a moment, Brian thought he might try to deflect again. "No," Gregory said finally. The word landed clean. "Okay," Brian said. "So just to make sure we're all aligned, someone used my name to justify firing one of the 3 people who built this company from the ground up." No one rushed to respond. Caroline didn't move, but Brian could feel her attention sharpen behind him. "Brian," another board member began, softer this time. "The circumstances following Rebecca's passing were unprecedented. Emotions were high, and decisions had to be made quickly to ensure stability." "Stability," Brian echoed. "That's a good word." He leaned forward slightly now, forearms resting on the table. "Help me understand how removing someone who understood the entire structure of the company contributed to that." "It wasn't a matter of understanding," Gregory said. "It was about alignment. We needed leadership willing to embrace new strategies, new markets." There was concern that she would keep doing what worked, Brian asked. The question wasn't sharp. That made it land harder. Gregory exhaled slowly. "That she might resist necessary evolution." Brian nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. "And when you explained that to her," he said, "you told her it came from me." "That was an interpretation." "No," Brian said quietly. "That was a statement." Silence again. Brian let it stretch this time, long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he sat back. "Okay," he said. "We're going to try this a different way." He glanced briefly toward Caroline, then back to the table. "As of today," he continued, "I'm no longer hands-off." There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, just stated. "I'm activating my voting shares," he said, "and I'm reviewing every major decision made in the last 4 years that carried my name." A ripple moved through the room. Not panic, not yet, but something close enough to register. Gregory straightened. "Brian, we've been acting in what we believed to be the best interests of the company." "I'm sure you have," Brian said. "Now we're going to verify that." He reached into the folder he'd brought, plain, unremarkable, and slid a document across the table. "This is notice of an internal audit," he said. "Full scope." The man with the precise posture leaned forward, scanning the document quickly. "This is extensive." "Yeah," Brian said. "That's intentional." "And who will be overseeing this process?" Gregory asked, voice tightening just enough to show the strain. Brian didn't look at him right away. Instead, he turned in his chair slightly, finally acknowledging the person who hadn't spoken yet. "Caroline," he said, "would you come sit down?" Every eye in the room shifted to her. For a heartbeat, she stayed where she was. Then she crossed the space, steady and composed, and took the empty seat beside Brian. The symbolism wasn't subtle. "This is Caroline Baxter," Brian said, though none of them needed the introduction. "Co-founder of this company. Former executive leadership. Apparently, underutilized resource." A faint, humorless smile touched her mouth. "She's here in an advisory capacity," Brian continued. "Effective immediately." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. "Brian, bringing former employees into confidential proceedings raises." "She's not a former employee to me," Brian said. She's one of the people who built this place before any of us were having these conversations. Another silence. Then, this is highly irregular, someone muttered. Yeah, Brian agreed. So is being told you fired someone when you didn't. That settled it. The room shifted fully now. Not controlled calm, not polite deflection, but something more honest, uneasy. Let's be clear, Brian said, his tone still measured. This isn't about undoing every decision that's been made. If something works, it stays. If it doesn't, we fix it. He paused, just long enough to make sure they were listening. But we don't lie about who made the calls, he added. Caroline spoke then, her voice steady, precise. I'd like access to the executive decision logs from the 6-month period following Rebecca's passing, she said, and any documentation related to leadership restructuring. Her gaze moved from one board member to the next, unflinching. If we're going to talk about alignment, she added, we should start by understanding what we're aligning to. Brian glanced at her, something like approval flickering in his expression. Gregory leaned back slowly, the weight of the situation settling in. You're asking for a significant level of transparency, he said. No, Brian replied. I'm requiring it. That landed differently. The meeting didn't end there. Not cleanly, not with resolution. But the tone had changed. Questions were no longer deflected. Answers, when given, were more careful, more complete. And beneath it all, something else had begun to take shape. Not just confrontation, correction. When Brian finally stood to leave, Caroline rose with him. The board remained at the table, quieter now, their earlier certainty replaced with calculation. At the door, Gregory spoke again. Brian, he said, if you're reopening all of this, you may find more than you expect. Brian paused, hand on the handle. I hope so, he said. Then he opened the door, and this time he didn't hesitate stepping through. Chapter 4. Carpentry and Consequences. The workshop smelled like cedar and varnish. It always did, but Brian noticed it more now. Maybe because it hadn't changed. He stood at the workbench, one hand braced against the sanded edge of a half-finished table, the other resting near a scattered row of tools. Morning light filtered in through the wide windows, catching the fine dust in the air and turning it into something almost deliberate. There was a rhythm to this place, a sequence. You measured, marked, cut, adjusted. If something went wrong, you didn't argue with it, you fixed it. Or you started over. Simple. Or at least simpler than boardrooms. You're doing that thing again. Caroline's voice carried from the doorway, light but observant. Brian didn't turn right away. What thing? The quiet staring, she said, stepping inside. Like you're having a full conversation with the wood. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It's a one-sided discussion. The wood's not very cooperative. Maybe it just doesn't agree with you. Wouldn't be the first. She walked further in, taking in the space. The walls lined with tools, the shelves stacked with materials, the steady sense that something here was always in progress. It still feels the same, she said. Yeah, Brian replied, turning back to the table. That's kind of the point. He picked up a small square, aligning it carefully against the edge of the wood, adjusting by a fraction. You ever think about how much of this is just correcting tiny mistakes? He added. You cut something a hair off, and suddenly you're compensating everywhere else. Caroline leaned against the workbench across from him. That feels like a metaphor. It is, he said. I just don't know how much of the company is one bad cut versus 4 years of adjustments stacked on top of each other. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for one of the sanding blocks and ran her thumb lightly across the surface, feeling the grit. They didn't just remove me, she said finally. They changed how decisions were made. Brian set the square down. You saw that already? I felt it before I left, she corrected. But now, she shook her head slightly. Seeing the logs you sent over last night, it's different. He crossed his arms loosely. Different how? They stopped asking questions, she said. Or at least, the right ones. That tracks, he muttered. Caroline pushed off the bench and began pacing slowly, her thoughts catching up to her words. Rebecca used to start everything with the client, she continued. Not just what they said they wanted, what they actually needed. Half those campaigns we reviewed yesterday. She let out a quiet breath. They're polished, technically solid, but they're off. Off how? They're convincing the client instead of listening to them, she said. It's subtle, but it's there. Brian nodded once, absorbing it. So instead of delivering what people ask for, they're telling them what they should want. Exactly. And calling it innovation. Exactly. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. Rebecca would hate that. Caroline smiled faintly. She'd dismantle it in about 5 minutes, and then rebuild it better out of spite. Yeah, he said quietly. That sounds like her. They let that sit for a moment. Not heavy, just present. Then Caroline exhaled and shifted gears. There's something else, she said. Brian looked up. What? She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, setting it on the workbench between them. These are internal emails I still had access to from when I left, she said. Nothing classified. Just threads that didn't make sense at the time. Brian opened the folder, scanning the first page. At a glance, it looked normal. Clean formatting, professional tone. Then he read more carefully. They keep referencing alignment with ownership, he said. Caroline nodded. Yeah. I never wrote any of this. I know, she replied. But they wrote it like you did. Brian flipped to the next page, jaw tightening just slightly. Per Brian's directive, he read aloud. He let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. That's efficient. It's strategic, she said. If they anchor decisions to you, no one questions them. Because I wasn't here to contradict it, he finished. Right? He closed the folder gently, pressing his palm against it for a second. Okay, he said. Caroline tilted her head. That's it? Just okay? He looked up at her, calm but focused. Getting angry doesn't fix it. No, she said. But it might be justified. Probably, he agreed. But I'd rather be effective. That earned a small nod. Fair, she said. From outside, the faint sound of laughter drifted through the open side door. Both of them turned instinctively. The kids were in the yard. Lily, Caroline's son Ethan, and her daughter Mia, attempting something ambitious involving a soccer ball, a jump rope, and what appeared to be a set of rules none of them fully understood. Mark stood nearby, arms crossed, offering commentary like a sports announcer who had given up on accuracy. And Ethan makes a bold decision to incorporate the rope. Absolutely unprecedented. It's not unprecedented, Ethan shouted. We invented it yesterday. Mark nodded. A historic development, then. Brian shook his head, a quiet chuckle escaping despite everything. They're adaptable, Caroline said, watching them. Kids usually are. Adults. She glanced back at him. Not so much. Depends, he said. Sometimes adults just need someone to point out they've been building something crooked. That's one way to put it. He tapped the folder lightly. This helps. But it's not enough. No, she agreed. It shows intent, not structure. Then we find the structure, he said. Caroline studied him for a moment. You're very calm about this. He considered that. I've had practice, he said finally. That softened something in her expression. Right? She said. That makes sense. He pushed off the bench and moved toward the wall, grabbing a roll of butcher paper and a pencil. What are you doing? She asked. Visualizing, he replied, unrolling the paper across the workbench. If we're going to untangle this, I need to see it. He started sketching rough boxes, lines connecting them, names where he knew them, gaps where he didn't. Caroline stepped closer, watching as the pieces began to take shape. You're mapping the company, she said. I'm mapping decision flow, he corrected. Who signs off? Who influences? Who benefits? She reached for the pencil, hesitated only a second, then added her own notes, names, arrows, small corrections to his layout. That's not right, she said, adjusting a line. This team reports here now. They changed that right after I left. Why? To centralize approvals, she said. At least that's what they claimed. Brian nodded. And in practice? It bottlenecks everything through a smaller group, she said. Which means fewer perspectives. Easier to control, he murmured. Exactly. They worked like that for a while, quietly, steadily, the paper filling with a rough map of something that had once been straightforward and was now layered. Complicated. Okay, Brian said after a while, stepping back slightly. So we've got concentrated decision-making, misuse of my name, and a shift away from client-driven work. Caroline nodded. That's the surface level. Good, he said. Then we start there. She looked at him, one eyebrow lifting. That's your big strategy? It's my first step, he said. You don't rebuild something by trying to fix everything at once. Caroline smiled faintly. Back to the wood analogy. Always back to the wood analogy, he confirmed. Outside, Lily suddenly appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. Dad. Yeah. Can we have popsicles? Brian blinked. That's not related to anything we're doing. It's extremely related, Lily insisted. We need energy. Caroline laughed. She's got a point. High-stakes backyard games require fuel. Brian shook his head, but he was already moving toward the kitchen. Fine. Popsicles. Lily grinned triumphantly and darted back outside. Caroline watched her go, then looked back at Brian. You know, she said, this might be the most unusual corporate recovery plan I've ever been part of. He handed her a popsicle from the freezer without looking at her. It's early, he said. We're still in the don't let everything fall apart phase. She accepted it, unwrapping the plastic with a small smile. And after that? Brian leaned against the counter, considering. After that, he said, we build it back the way it was meant to be. Caroline nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. I think Rebecca would like that. Brian didn't answer. But this time, the silence that followed didn't feel uncertain. Felt like alignment. Chapter 5. Unraveling threads. The office didn't feel the way Brian remembered it. It wasn't obvious at first. The lobby still held the same clean lines, The same neutral tones Rebecca had insisted on, calm, deliberate, designed to make people feel like they were being listened to before they even spoke. But something underneath it had shifted. He could feel it as soon as the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. The energy was tighter, more contained. Conversations quieted just a fraction too quickly when people noticed him walking by. "They're watching you," Caroline said under her breath as they moved down the hall. "I'd be disappointed if they weren't," Brian replied. She gave him a sideways look. "That's not reassuring." "It's not supposed to be," he said. They reached the conference room that had become their temporary headquarters, if that wasn't too generous a word for a space filled with printed documents, laptops, and more coffee than either of them was proud of. Caroline dropped her bag onto the table and immediately began sorting through the latest set of reports. "These came in this morning," she said, sliding a stack toward Brian. "Updated financial summaries, department breakdowns." He flipped through them, scanning quickly. On paper, everything looked solid, profitable, organized. "Too clean," he muttered. Caroline nodded. "That's what I thought." He looked up. "Explain." She crossed her arms, leaning back slightly against the table. "When something's actually running well, it's messy," she said. "Not chaotic, but real. This," she gestured at the documents. "This is curated." "Meaning what?" "Meaning someone is deciding what we get to see," she replied. Brian tapped the edge of the stack thoughtfully. "So the question is, what aren't we seeing?" "Exactly." The door opened before he could respond further. A man stepped in, mid-40s, suit perfectly tailored, expression carefully neutral. "Brian," he said. "Caroline." "Daniel," Brian said, recognizing him from the board meeting. "Good timing." Daniel gave a polite nod. "I thought it might be helpful to check in. See if you needed anything further to facilitate the audit process." Brian leaned back in his chair. "Funny," he said. "I was just thinking the same thing." Caroline didn't sit. She stayed standing, positioned just slightly to the side, not passive but observant. "We do need something," she said. Daniel shifted his attention to her. "Of course. We need access to the raw client feedback data from the last 2 years," she said. "Not summaries, not executive reports, the actual submissions." A flicker, small but there. "That's a substantial request," Daniel replied. "There are privacy considerations, contractual." "It's our data," Brian said evenly. "We're reviewing our own company." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what can be arranged." "Don't arrange it," Caroline said. "Provide it." The correction was calm, precise. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly. "I'll expedite the request." "Good," Brian said. There was a pause, one of those moments where everyone knew the conversation wasn't actually finished, but no one had said the next sentence yet. Daniel broke it. "Progress can be complicated," he said, "particularly when revisiting past decisions." Brian studied him for a second. "Only if those decisions don't hold up," he said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "I'll follow up with your requested materials." And then he left. The door clicked shut behind him. Caroline exhaled, not quite a sigh. "He's nervous." "He should be," Brian said. She shook her head slightly. "No, not about the audit. About what we're asking for." Brian looked back down at the documents, then up at her again. "You think the problem isn't just internal decisions," he said. "I think," she replied carefully, "that if they've been shifting how we approach clients, the clients are going to notice. And if they noticed," he said slowly, "there'd be feedback. That might not match the reports we're seeing," she finished. Brian nodded once. "Okay, that's a thread. And we pull it," she said. They didn't have to wait long. By mid-afternoon, a secure data file arrived, delivered faster than Brian expected, which in itself felt like information. Caroline opened it first, scanning through entries with increasing focus. "Okay," she said after a few minutes. "Here." She turned the laptop toward him. The first few entries were exactly what you'd expect. Positive feedback, strong results, satisfied clients. Then they scrolled further, and there it was, subtle at first. "I felt like my concerns weren't fully heard. The final product was good, but not quite aligned with our initial request. We appreciated the effort, but it seemed like the team had a different vision than we did." Brian leaned closer, reading line after line. None of it was catastrophic, but it was consistent. That was worse. "They're not failing," he said. "They're drifting." Caroline nodded. "And they're smoothing it over in the summaries." "Of course they are," he murmured. She clicked into another set of feedback. "Look at the timestamps," she said. Brian frowned. "What about them?" "These comments," she said, pointing. "They don't appear in the quarterly reports from the same periods." He straightened slightly. "They removed them, or filtered them out," she said. "Either way, leadership wouldn't see the pattern unless they went looking for it." "And no one did," Brian said. Caroline met his eyes. "Except us." Silence settled between them, not heavy, but focused. "Okay," Brian said finally. "So we've got misrepresented feedback, controlled reporting, and decision-making bottlenecked at the top." Caroline leaned against the table again. And a culture shift that no one acknowledged out loud. From the doorway, a voice cut in. I'm starting to feel like I walked into the middle of a detective show. Mark stepped inside holding a paper bag and 2 coffees. You brought reinforcements, Caroline said with a faint smile. I bring essentials, he corrected, setting the bag down. And mild commentary. Brian accepted one of the coffees. You're just in time. We discovered the company's been quietly ignoring what clients actually say. Mark winced. Ah, classic. Caroline glanced at him. You say that like you've seen it before. I've worked with people, Mark said. Same principle. Brian huffed a quiet laugh. Fair. Mark leaned against the counter, looking between them. So what's the next move? He asked. Brian didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the screen, at the pattern that had been hidden just beneath the surface. Then he looked at Caroline. We stop letting them control the narrative, he said. She nodded slowly. And replace it with the truth. Exactly. Mark sipped his coffee. Bold strategy. I approve. Brian leaned back in his chair, something steady settling into place. First, he said, we bring this to the board. Not the summaries, the raw data. And when they push back? Caroline asked. They will, Brian said. Which is why we don't stop there. Her expression sharpened slightly. What are you thinking? He held her gaze. We talk to the clients, he said. Caroline blinked. Directly. Directly, he confirmed. If the company forgot how to listen, we remind it. A slow smile spread across her face. Familiar, unmistakable. Rebecca would have liked that, she said. Brian nodded once. Yeah, he replied. She would. In the quiet that followed, the weight of everything they'd uncovered settled, not as something overwhelming, but as something clear. Path. Messy, complicated, and long overdue. But forward. Chapter 6. The Return of Intent. The email went out at 8:12 a.m. Brian reread it once before sending, not for tone, not for polish, but for accuracy. It was brief, direct, clear in a way that didn't leave space for interpretation. He didn't sign it as interim owner or acting authority, or anything softened for comfort. Just, Brian Keller, majority shareholder. The message itself was even simpler. Effective immediately, Caroline Baxter has been reinstated in a senior leadership capacity and will assist in the ongoing company-wide audit and operational review. All departments are expected to cooperate fully. Additional updates to follow. That was it. No justification. No corporate cushioning. He hit send, set the phone down and exhaled. Well, he muttered. That should get their attention. From across the kitchen, Lily paused mid-bite of her cereal. Did you just send something important? Very, Brian said, pouring himself coffee. Did it have big words? Some, he admitted. She nodded, satisfied. Then it was definitely important. He smiled faintly. That's a solid metric. By the time he dropped her off at school and made his way to the office, his phone had already lit up with responses, none of which he'd opened yet. He didn't need to. He knew what they'd say. The tension hit the moment he stepped onto the floor. Not subtle this time. Conversations didn't just quiet. They stopped. People glanced up from desks, from screens, from carefully constructed routines that had operated uninterrupted until exactly 8:12 a.m. Caroline walked beside him, composed but alert. Better reaction than yesterday, she said under her breath. More honest, he replied. That earned a small nod. By the time they reached the executive conference room, 3 board members were already there. Gregory, Daniel, and a third, Elaine Mercer, who had said very little in previous meetings but watched everything with unsettling precision. Brian, Gregory said, standing as they entered. We need to discuss this announcement. Good, Brian said. Let's do that. He didn't wait for permission to sit this time. Caroline followed, taking the seat beside him without hesitation. Elaine's gaze flicked between them before settling on Brian. Reinstating former leadership without consultation is disruptive. Yes, Brian said. It is. Gregory exhaled slowly, fingers lacing together in front of him. We understand your concerns, Brian. Truly. But this level of abrupt change creates instability across the organization. Instability compared to what? Brian asked. What we had yesterday? Daniel leaned forward. What we had yesterday was functioning. Was it? Brian asked calmly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it was functioning in a way that hid problems instead of fixing them. Silence. Brian let it sit, then reached for the folder he'd brought. Client feedback, he said, sliding copies across the table. Raw data. Unfiltered. Elaine picked one up first, scanning quickly. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. These don't match the executive summaries, she said. No, Caroline replied. They don't. Gregory took his own copy, flipping through it more slowly. These are isolated concerns. No, Brian said. They're consistent. They don't indicate systemic failure. They indicate drift, Caroline said, which becomes failure if you ignore it long enough. Daniel set his copy down. Feedback like this is part of growth. Adjustments happen. That doesn't mean the overall strategy is flawed. It does if the adjustments never make it into decision-making, Brian replied. That's an interpretation, Daniel said. It's a pattern, Caroline corrected. The room tightened again. Less debate now, more friction. Gregory leaned back, studying both of them. And bringing Caroline back solves this? No, Brian said. It starts solving it. He gestured lightly toward her. She understands what the company was built to do. That's not something we need to rediscover from scratch. Elaine spoke again, quieter but more direct. And what role do you intend for her to play, long-term? There it was. The real question. Brian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Caroline just briefly, not for permission, not for agreement, but acknowledgement. Then he turned back. That depends on what we find, he said. But I'm not interested in temporary fixes. Gregory's expression sharpened slightly. You're considering restructuring leadership. I'm considering aligning leadership with the company's actual purpose, Brian said. Daniel let out a controlled breath. This is moving very quickly. 4 years isn't quick, Brian replied. That cut clean. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elaine closed the folder and set it down with deliberate care. If we accept that there are gaps, she said, then the question becomes how you intend to address them without destabilizing existing operations. Brian leaned forward slightly. We don't tear everything down, he said. We fix what's broken. We keep what works. And how do you determine that balance? Gregory asked. Brian didn't hesitate. We listen, he said. The word hung there, simple, almost too simple. Caroline nodded once beside him. To the clients, she added. Directly. Daniel frowned. You're proposing bypassing existing reporting structures. I'm proposing verifying them, Brian said. That opens the door to inconsistency, Gregory said. No, Brian replied. It opens the door to accuracy. Another pause. This one felt different. Less resistance, more calculation. Finally, Gregory exhaled, shoulders shifting just slightly. Very well, he said. We'll allow this process to move forward. With conditions. Brian raised an eyebrow. Conditions. Transparency, Elaine said. On all sides. You'll have it, Brian said. And oversight, Daniel added. You'll have that too, Brian said. Gregory nodded once, though the acceptance felt measured. Then we proceed carefully. Brian stood, not waiting for further discussion. Careful is fine, he said. Stagnant isn't. Caroline rose with him. As they left the room, the tension followed, but it no longer felt like something pressing down. Felt like something shifting. Back in the hallway, Caroline let out a quiet breath. That went better than expected. They didn't have a clean way to argue it, Brian said. No, she agreed. But they're not on board. They don't have to be yet. She glanced at him. You're very sure about that. I don't need them convinced, he said. I need them paying attention. That part, she admitted. You've definitely accomplished. They reached her temporary office, if clearing out a conference room counted. Stacks of files, open laptops, notes pinned to a board that had grown more crowded by the day. Caroline stepped inside, then paused. You know, she said, turning back to him. This is the weirdest return to work I've ever had. Brian leaned against the doorframe. You're doing great so far. I haven't done anything yet. You showed up, he said. That counts more than you think. She smiled faintly at that, then moved further in, setting her bag down. Brian watched her for a second, not just seeing her in the space, but recognizing what it meant. Not nostalgia, not obligation, correction. Okay, she said, rolling up her sleeves slightly. What's next? Brian pushed off the frame and stepped inside. We start talking to clients, he said. Caroline's expression sharpened again. Focused, ready. Directly, she repeated. Directly, he confirmed. She nodded once. Then let's remind them who we are, she said. Brian smiled just a little. Yeah, he said. Let's do that. Chapter 7, Ownership. The boardroom filled earlier than usual. Word had spread, quietly at first, then with the unmistakable momentum of something people didn't fully understand but knew mattered. By the time Brian stepped through the glass doors, every seat was occupied. Not just board members this time, but senior leadership as well. The people who made decisions. The people who had been making them unchecked. Caroline entered beside him, steady, composed, but not rigid. There was no hesitation in her stride now. Whatever uncertainty had followed her back into the building had burned off somewhere between late-night documents and early morning resolve. Gregory stood at the far end of the table. You asked for this session, he said. We assumed it was time. It is, Brian replied. He didn't take a seat immediately. Instead, he placed a thick stack of folders on the table, letting the weight of them land with quiet finality. This, he said, resting a hand on the top file, is the last 4 years. No one interrupted. Brian glanced once at Caroline, then back to the room. We've reviewed financials, internal communications, structural changes, and client feedback, he continued. Some of it checks out. Some of it doesn't. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Brian, let me finish, Brian said, not raising his voice. Daniel stopped. Brian nodded once and continued. The company's still profitable. Some teams are doing excellent work. That stays. He paused, letting that settle before moving on. But there are patterns here that can't be ignored. He opened the top folder and turned it so it faced the room. Filtered client feedback, he said. Consistent removal of concerns from executive summaries. Caroline stepped forward then, picking up the thread seamlessly. Departments reporting up through newly centralized structures that limit input diversity. She added. Decisions being framed as aligned with ownership without validation. Elaine spoke this time, voice measured. We've acknowledged those discrepancies. Brian nodded. Good. Then we're all starting from the same place. He let that sit for a moment. Then he opened another folder. This one matters more, he said. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Internal communications, he explained. Specifically, anything that referenced directive authority in the 6 months following Rebecca's death. Gregory's posture tightened just slightly. Brian didn't miss it. He pulled out a printed email and read aloud. Per Brian's directive, we will proceed with leadership realignment effective immediately. He set it down, then reached for another. In accordance with ownership's intent to move in a new direction, we are restructuring executive roles. Another page. Brian is aligned with these changes and has requested a streamlined leadership structure. He looked up. I didn't write any of these, he said. No one spoke. Caroline's voice cut through the silence. And these communications were used to justify the removal of key personnel, she said, including myself. All eyes shifted. Gregory leaned forward, hands clasped tightly now. Brian, these were interpretations at the time. The company needed. No, Brian said, firm now. They weren't interpretations. They were statements. He stepped closer to the table, the edge of control sharpening. Not lost, not explosive, but fully present. They told people I made decisions I never made, he continued. They used my name to give weight to choices I didn't approve. Daniel tried again, quieter this time. The intent was to preserve stability. Stability doesn't require lying, Brian said. That landed. Not loudly, but undeniably. Silence spread across the room, heavier now. Not defensive, not argumentative. Understanding. Caroline spoke again, but this time her tone had changed. Less analysis. More resolution. You removed the company's ability to question itself, she said. You took away the feedback that made it work. Elaine exhaled slowly. We believed we were guiding it toward growth. And you might have been, Brian said. But you did it the wrong way. He straightened, every word deliberate. This company was built on listening, he said. Not just to clients, to each other. He gestured lightly toward Caroline. There were 3 of us at the start, he said. 3. We argued. We disagreed. We figured things out because no one pretended they had all the answers. Caroline met his gaze briefly, not sentimental, just aligned. Brian looked back at the board. You removed one of those voices, he said. And you told her it came from me. Gregory's composure cracked just a fraction. That was a mistake. Yes, Brian said. It was. A long pause followed. Then Brian took a breath, not to calm down but to shift. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about correction. He slid a final document across the table. This is what happens next. Elaine picked it up first, scanning quickly. Her eyes flicked up almost immediately. You're restructuring executive authority. I am, Brian said. Daniel leaned in, reading over her shoulder. You're reinstating distributed decision-making, he said, surprise cutting through his tone. And he stopped, looking up. Formalizing leadership review. And? Gregory asked, though his voice already carried an edge of recognition. Brian didn't look at the paper this time. He didn't need to. And appointing a new CEO, Daniel finished. The room went very still. Brian let the silence stretch, just long enough. Then, Caroline Baxter, he said. No hesitation. No build-up. Just truth. Caroline didn't move right away. Not out of uncertainty, out of respect for the moment. For what it meant and what it cost and what it would require next. Gregory exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. This will be controversial. Probably, Brian said. It will face resistance. I expect it to. Elaine closed the document carefully. And you believe this restores the company? No, Brian said. I believe it gives us a chance to restore it. He glanced at Caroline just briefly. She already knows how. Caroline stepped forward then, finally taking the space fully. I'm not here to go backward, she said. We're not recreating what we were. We're rebuilding what works. Her eyes moved across the room. Not confrontational, but unflinching. If you stay, she added, you commit to that. Transparency, accountability, listening. Not because it sounds good, but because it's the only reason this company exists. No one interrupted. No one dismissed it. The resistance didn't disappear, but it shifted. From defiance to consideration. Gregory looked at Brian for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Very well, he said. It wasn't enthusiastic. But it wasn't a refusal. Elaine followed with a quieter nod. Daniel hesitated, then inclined his head once. One by one, the room settled. Not unanimous approval, but acceptance. Brian exhaled, not relief, not exactly. Completion. Something that had been misaligned had just been set straight. Caroline looked at him, the weight of it registering. Not as pressure, but as purpose. So, Mark's voice said from the back of the room. He had somehow made his way in unnoticed, leaning casually against the doorframe. Does this mean I should start calling you both corporate revolutionaries? Or is that too dramatic? A few surprised glances flicked toward him. Caroline blinked. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to feel underdressed, he said. Brian shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. Stick with support staff, he said. Mark considered. I can work with that. The room, still tense moments ago, eased just slightly. Not everything, but enough. Because for the first time in a long time, everyone knew exactly who was in charge. And more importantly, why. Chapter 8, building forward. 3 weeks later, the office felt different. Not cleaner, not louder, not even more efficient, though it was in quiet ways. The change was harder to pinpoint. It breathed. Brian leaned against the glass wall of a conference room, arms loosely crossed, watching a group of junior designers present ideas to Caroline. The energy inside was unmistakable. Animated, slightly chaotic, full of overlapping voices and unpolished thoughts. And no one was shutting it down. Caroline didn't interrupt. She didn't steer immediately. She listened, really listened, the way Rebecca had always insisted they do. Let the idea come out messy first. Truth showed up in the rough edges. One of the designers paused mid-sentence, frowning. Wait, she said, looking at her own notes. That's not what they asked for, is it? Caroline smiled slightly. What did they ask for? The designer hesitated, then nodded to herself. Not that. Okay, let me start over. Brian exhaled quietly, something in his chest loosening. That was it. That was the difference. He stayed there another minute, then pushed off the wall and headed down the hall. Watching like a proud parent? Mark's voice called out from a nearby office. Brian glanced in. You're not even supposed to be here today. Mark shrugged from behind a desk that clearly wasn't his. I like to keep my schedule unpredictable. It adds mystery. It adds confusion, Brian said. Same thing, Mark replied. Brian stepped inside, leaning casually against the doorframe. How's it feel? Mark asked, more serious now. Brian considered the question. Quieter, he said finally. Mark blinked. That's not what I expected. Not quieter out there, Brian clarified, gesturing toward the hallway. Up here. He tapped his temple lightly. It used to feel like something was off, and I just wasn't looking at it. And now I looked at it, Brian said. So it's not lingering anymore. Mark nodded slowly. That sounds like closure. Not quite, Brian said. But it's closer. Mark leaned back in his chair. And you didn't even have to dramatically storm a room or flip a table. Disappointing, I know. A little, Mark admitted. I had money on a table flip. Brian huffed a quiet laugh and pushed off the frame. Stick to bread. I excel at bread, Mark called after him. Later that afternoon, Brian found Caroline in what had become her office, though it still didn't quite look like one. Files were stacked, yes. Laptops open, notes everywhere. But there were also handwritten reminders pinned to the board in uneven spacing. Ask the client why, not just what. Don't rush alignment. Clarity beats speed. Brian leaned lightly against the doorframe, arms crossed. You're starting to make it yours, he said. Caroline glanced up, surprised for half a second before her expression softened. It's getting there, she said. Still feels like I walked out one afternoon and came back years later to a different version. Because you did, he said. She nodded, not arguing. For a moment, they didn't say anything. Then she leaned back slightly in her chair. They're adjusting faster than I expected. The board? Brian asked. Everyone, she said. There's resistance, sure. But not as much as there could be. Brian considered that. People usually want things to work, he said. They just go along with whatever they think that looks like. And now? She asked. Now they know they can question it again, he said. Caroline smiled faintly. That helps, he nodded. She studied him for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. How are you doing? The question was simple. Not about the company, about everything else. Brian didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the room fully, glancing at the board, the notes, the work in progress. Then he looked back at her. Better, he said. She didn't push for more, and he appreciated that. After a second, she nodded. Good. He moved closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of one of the chairs. You're doing exactly what she would have wanted, he added. Caroline's expression shifted, not heavy, not sad, just grounded. I hope so, she said. You are, Brian replied. That time, she believed him. That evening, the house was louder than usual. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by construction paper, markers, and what Brian strongly suspected was glitter, despite previous agreements about glitter. "You said no glitter," he said, narrowing his eyes slightly. "I said some glitter," Lily corrected, not looking up. "There is no such thing as some glitter. It's controlled," she insisted. "That is not reassuring." From the couch, Caroline laughed, watching the exchange unfold. Mark sat beside her, examining what appeared to be a crayon drawing with intense focus. "I think this captures a bold interpretation of our current situation," he said. "It's a unicorn," Mia corrected. Mark nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly." Brian shook his head, then crouched down beside Lily. "What are we making?" he asked. "A sign," she said. "For what?" She held it up triumphantly. It was uneven, colorful, and covered in, yes, too much glitter. The words were written in large, determined letters. "Welcome back." Brian stared at it for a second. "Where's this going?" he asked. Lily pointed toward the front door. "There." "For who?" She paused, then shrugged like it was obvious. "Everyone." Caroline's smile softened at that. Mark leaned back against the couch. "Broad target audience. I respect that." Brian sat back on his heels, looking at the sign, then at Lily. "Okay," he said. "We can work with that." She beamed. Together, they taped it to the inside of the front door. Slightly crooked, glitter catching the light in uneven bursts. When Brian stepped back, it looked imperfect, messy, bright, exactly right. He crossed his arms loosely, taking it in. Behind him, Caroline joined him at the door. "It fits," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. They stood there for a moment, not saying anything, not needing to. In the living room, the kids had already moved on to something else. Mark was attempting to explain the strategic importance of snack distribution with entirely too much seriousness. Life, continuing. Not the same, but not supposed to be. Brian glanced once more at the sign, at the simple words written in a child's uneven hand. "Welcome back." It wasn't about returning to what had been. It was about stepping into what came next, with clarity, with honesty, with the people who mattered still standing beside you. He exhaled quietly, something steady settling into place. Not an ending. Never that. Just forward.